get this the process that we've developed out there a little bit more in the open. So the conference A2E2 collects people from around Australia who are interested in engineering education in general, and the presentation that I wanted to give there was around how we do assessment of honours projects, particularly for seminar and expo style presentations, where we typically have a number of markers and we can't always guarantee consistency from one marker to the next. So to overcome problems that, or to overcome small issues that arose from time to time, and to make the process more efficient, we developed a robust statistical approach for handling these sorts of situations. I'm not going to claim that we have developed the perfect or the best approach, but I think it is better than the naive approach that you might be tempted to start out with if you were building a process like this from the ground up. So in a little bit more detail around the context here, so when students are undertaking an engineering honours project, now we call this course research project, but obviously these can come in a variety of forms. Students typically are assessed on their communication skills as well as their technical content. So we have both oral presentations in the form of a formal seminar conference-like presentation. This is typically to an academic panel. It happens over 2 days at the university. We also have an expo presentation, which is a little bit more like a conference poster session, or just a typical trade show style expo, where the students, as you can see on the screen here, will present to the general public, as well as to roaming/wandering academics and industry judges. So for the seminars, they give a structured talk that has to fit within a time limit, and it's essentially intended to require the students to convey dense technical information in a constrained period of time. Whereas for the expo presentation, it's more like a conversation. There's no script, there's no preset questions. The industry judges will be talking to the students about their projects, and what comes out will depend on what the background of the judges are and what they're interested in. Why we needed to approach a more rigorous process here was initially, and maybe primarily, is to create greater transparency in the process and give the students better feedback. So when I first started coordinating the honours project course, we would typically collate all the marks, do some calculations in a big spreadsheet, and then calculate for each student the final grade and just give that back to them in the form of a single mark. And that was okay for a while, but students wanted to know, why did I get a better mark than my friend, or where did I lose marks? I'd like to know more information about how this mark was created. The very first thing that you notice when you start to provide more transparency is that discrepancies in the marking become more obvious, and this is a good thing. If we have 4 people in the room giving marks and one of them is very high or very low, that should be taken into account in how the marks get collated. And so in order to create a more rigorous process, we needed to somehow, it's not always possible, to mitigate the subjectivity from marker to marker, and probably more possible is to mitigate potential bias of the marker, like systematic error essentially, from one marker to the next. You might have someone who's consistently optimistic and gives high marks, or someone that's consistently negative or grumpy and gives low marks. So this addresses this discrepancies that you see to some degree from one person to the next. The second part of the process that was really important to me was to make sure that any workflow that we developed had an efficient processing workflow. So again, back when I first started coordinating honours projects, we would be handing out pieces of paper to judges in rooms over the course of 2 days. This would be hundreds of pieces of paper. They would write down their marks with a pen on those pieces of paper. The paper would be collated. We'd sit down in a room with a spreadsheet, manually typing up all of the numbers. It was error prone. It took a long time, and it as time went by, we needed to have a better system. So with all of these things in mind, the outcomes of the work that we have done has produced an approach which I think, or we could argue, is more fair, more robust, more defensible, it's more consistent, and it is transparent in the assessment of the student marks. Anecdotally, it has led to reducing the number of unhappy students. Now, when I first gave this presentation, one of the criticisms I received was that we shouldn't be aiming to have happy or unhappy students. You know, we shouldn't be designing our courses to basically to keep people happy. We're assessing them. You know, you'll always have some unhappy students, and sure, that's correct. But when there's a perception of unfairness, it can really influence the student's well-being. And I would hate for the number one thing that a student remembers 10 years after finishing their honours project is when they gave their seminar, there was one grumpy academic in the room, and they lost some marks because of that. And for that to stick in their mind as one of the memorable elements of their course was something we'd like to avoid. We want them to remember the happy times. So just as a little bit of broad context about our honours research project course, is that it follows in a chain of professional practice courses through the 4 years of the engineering undergraduate curriculum. So now that is we've got a single level 1 course, which is Introduction to Engineering. We have 2 sort of split courses in level 3, which is one is research methods, the other is more focused on systems engineering. And at the successful completion of all of those, plus your other technical coursework, in level 4 you take a year-long or 2-semester honours research course, and this is 25% of the student's load. So in the last few years we've combined our honours project offering from being run in each individual engineering school separately to one very large course in which all of the students come together in a melting pot. Now the students still do discipline-specific projects but with their discipline-specific supervisors, but the coordination is all done at a central level, and this has led to a number of efficiencies for the most part. Now with scale comes some complexity. So with when we were mechanical engineering only, we had about 50 students per year, about 200 students. About 50 projects, 200 students. Now that we're engineering wide, we're about double that. So when we're dealing with expo marks, which are done on a group level, we've got about 100 marks that need to be calculated. When we're dealing with seminars, we have about 300 marks that need to be calculated because those come as those are marked individually. I've mentioned a couple of times about having a transparent process, but also a repeatable and efficient process. So it's been rightly or wrongly one of the things I've spent quite a little bit of time on over the last quite a number of years now to build up a more and more complicated workflow in terms of handling these processes. So I won't break down the entire the chain of things to do here because it's kind of getting a little bit outside the scope of this particular talk, which is just about marks processing. But I think it's really important to emphasize the need for having robust processes, and as I'm now getting to a point where I'm looking to transfer, well, as I'm doing other things with my academic life and other people are coming in to help me with the honours project course, it's becoming more and more apparent how important it is to have a transferable workflow that other people can use. As you can see here, with the way that we do the seminars is a little bit more complicated, so we'll focus on them in the broad strokes here. You can see that in order to run the seminar event, we've got workflows that involve Excel, MATLAB, JavaScript, LaTeX, and Lua, all touching data at various points in time. Now, if I was to rewrite this from scratch today, I would be using Python to cut out at least one or two of these different elements, but we couldn't do it all with a single tool, so you can imagine that this didn't happen overnight. The main focus of this talk is around the fact that we have this assessment point in time. Obviously this happens in real time, the academics in the room. We now use a Google form to collate all of the marks that the academics enter. The reason that we use a Google form rather than a Microsoft form or a SurveyMonkey form or a number of other online forms is that Google Forms has a really good, or I should just say it has a public API. So we can actually program the Google form to have exactly the projects that we want in the order that they're presenting, with the student names entered in without the academic needing to type in anything, which we've found from experience always ends up being error prone. Even if you only have a few academics making typos, it really complicates the marks collation at the end of the day. After we get the raw marks from Google Forms, it then goes through a collation and post-processing step. Happen to use MATLAB at the moment for this, but not for any particular reason. And then the workflow that I'm talking about today all happens inside of Excel. So Excel pulls in a giant CSV file which has every mark from every academic for every student, and does all of the processing in there. Once we've actually finished the data processing, we'll talk a little bit about the later steps of the process at the end of this talk. So to go back to the problem, we have seen from experience that when you have multiple academics in a room, there are levels of inconsistency between what they award. Now, when you have 6, 7, 8 assessors in a room, which is possible at an expo where we have industry judges coming through, we invite as many industry judges as we can get our hands on, and it's not uncommon for having quite a number of marks per group. Some of the things that we're talking about here come out in the wash when you've got larger numbers of assessors. But in a seminar scenario, when you might only have 3, 4, or 5 assessors, outliers can still create differences in the marks which the students get upset about. In some cases, it's the perception of unfairness rather than the effect of the overall course mark that they're worried about. So the inconsistencies that we see come in two flavors. So, and this would be using familiar terminology. So essentially we see random errors in the marks and systematic errors in the marks between assessors. So the random errors there's not very much that we can do about. So if an academic has just had coffee or a food break, then they might be feeling a little bit happier. Or if they, if it's kind of mid-morning and they're on a bit of an energy high, then they might be giving higher marks than if they need some coffee or if they need some food or if they're falling asleep at the end of the day. Of course, people always make, regardless of how carefully we construct the forms, people always make small mistakes when they're putting their marks into online forms. And random error comes through with unconscious and conscious bias in all sorts of different ways around a number of factors which can be either technical related, they might be in the field that the student is working in and they're predisposed to liking it more, or they might be more critical because they know the topics in more detail, as well as a range of other biases which you can imagine from things like ethnicity, gender, and so on. Now, these can be random in the sense that you don't often know from one student to the next. how much variation that you will see in, for example, in the ethnicity or the gender. But some of these can also be systematic. So typically we will be clustering judges in their areas of expertise when they go and sit down in front of people. So these can also be systematic errors. So their discipline expertise, whether they are typically a nice academic or a tough academic. We also see systematic differences around the levels of experience. So a junior academic in some cases can be harsher because they haven't really calibrated themselves very much and they're out to make a name for themselves. They feel like, life was hard for them, so they're going to make life hard for other people. I mean, unconsciously, or they might be younger and they might be enthusiastic and they might be, everyone, they're trying to be friends with everyone. They're giving high marks all over the place. Neither of these two things are bad if we can account for those systematic differences. So with a range of random systematic errors in the marks that we're looking at, we might be able to look at some trends and account for the systematic errors, and we'll talk about how we do that in a minute. But the other issue with that we have is for random errors, typically you might have outliers. And when we're dealing with such low sampling numbers, so we've got n of 3, 4, or 5, traditional statistics like the mean and standard deviation are not robust at finding those outliers. So there's a sort of a sketch on the screen here of 4 data points with one as an outlier, and despite being quite significantly an outlier just visually looking at it, because there are only 4 data points here, that outlier is still within 2 standard deviations of the mean. So it's very hard to come up with let's say it's impossible to come up with a traditional standard deviation approach of detecting outliers, because as the outlier grows, the standard deviation grows as well. Instead of using mean and standard deviation, the traditional statistics, we are using robust statistics instead. Now, these are often called M estimators, and we don't have too much time to go through the theory here, but I was really influenced by a paper called Robust Estimation in Very Small Samples. So we kind of adapted the algorithm and the method outlined in that paper for the work that we do here. So traditionally, to find an outlier, you might use standard deviation and calculate what is something called a z-score, which is essentially the normalized difference from the mean. The robust method is equivalent to that, whereas instead of calculating a z-score, we calculate a range using location and scale. So location is the robust version of the mean, scale is the robust version of the standard deviation. And this can be done using the algorithm on screen. Now, in another video, I would really love to break this down with some pretty graphs and explain the background here. But for now, I'd like you to take us at our word that this does what we say it does. So there's a few things in here which end up being essentially magic parameters that you need to use some good testing to make sure it actually works well. And as what's been highlighted here, those essentially are the initial guesses for the location, the initial guess for the scale. So because this is an iterative method, you can end up with different outcomes depending on what your initial guesses are. And so we use the median as our initial guess for the location. And we know that median is robust against outliers. And we use the absolute deviation from AAEE. What was my acronym for this? Sorry, it's been about a year since I put these slides together. We have a similar guess here for the scale, noting that for very small sample numbers, if you end up with too many of the very same number, you can have a scale which collapses down to 0. So this is called implosion in the robust statistics community, I suppose. So there's a little plus epsilon here, which kind of helps us to overcome that kind of that implosion, which can sometimes lead to like divide by 0 errors. So with this robust approach of finding a location and a scale, we've got the guesses, we do the iteration. We can then calculate assessor weightings. So, and I'll show you an example of how we go through this process on the next slide. So once we've rescaled all of the assessor marks based on their average marks that they're giving to the students, we can then determine the outliers. And once again, there's a couple of different ways that you could calibrate the cost function for finding those outliers. And in particular, you're looking for a threshold, and a threshold of about 2 seems to work fine for us. This is equivalent to 2 standard deviations in the traditional approach. So that's the robust approach, which is used to find these location and scale metrics, and then to identify, using those metrics to identify the outliers. I'd like to break down in a little bit more detail how we take the raw marks and apply weightings to them to try and eliminate the systematic error. So we, to illustrate this, I've got a toy example here with 6 students and 3 assessors. So the very first step here is to look at a student by student basis and say, okay, what is the location of the marks for each student, regardless of who assessed them? So in this particular example, we're usually seeing 2 marks per student, and for an n equals 2, the location equals the mean. So you can see here they've got a 60 and a 54. The robust location in that scenario is a 57. You'll have to take us at our word that when you have more marks there, you end up with a number which is not quite the same as the mean, but it often is, or often is very close. Okay, so we've got the location of each student, which is kind of like the robust average. We then rescale all of the marks for each student based on that average. So we now have basically a normalized mark from each assessor for each student. So in that very first case that's been highlighted there, we've got assessor 1 giving a mark of 60, and that's rescaled to 1.05 because the location was 57. So you can see assessor 1's given them a higher, well, we saw before, assessor 1 gave them a higher mark, 60, assessor 3 gave them a lower mark. That's now been rescaled so that regardless of the average of each student, we're getting a normalized view of whether they got a higher or a lower mark per assessor. Oh, that box is not aligned anymore. For these weightings, we can then use the robust average again, the location of all of those normalized marks on a per assessor basis. So what you can see here is assessor 1, half of the students they assessed got 1.05, the other half got 0.95. So on average, or on robust average, their overall weighting equals 1. Assessor 3, which I've highlighted there, they gave marks which were below 1 for every student that they assessed. So on average, and again on robust average, they gave lower marks, and therefore they're a harder or a harsher assessor. We can then use these robust averages per assessor to rescale the original marks. And so you can see here in the example, the first assessor gave the first student a 60, and we gave them a weighting of 1 because they, on average, they were giving marks which were sometimes higher, sometimes lower, but on average were equal to the mean, the robustly. The third assessor we said was a harsher marker on average, and so when they take their original score, 54, divided by that robust normalized weighting, then their mark gets increased to a 58. Finally, we then take the location of all of the marks assigned to each student by each assessor after that reweighting process, and this is what allows us to calculate the final grade for that student. This is more what it looks like at the large scale. So across the top we would have the assessors, down the side we would have the students, and this is sort of indicative of the kind of raw data that we're dealing with here. So you can see that it's quite sparse, but there is overlap, and in some ways when we are assigning assessors, we kind of assume that there's going to be a bit of spread around so that different pools of academics are assessing overlapping groups of students. So this kind of ends up meaning that we get enough distribution of assessors across the student pool that the statistics, roughly speaking, do work to allow us to do some of these systematic variances. So just to recap, those raw marks then get translated into assessor weightings. The assessor weightings are used to re-weight the raw marks to get weighted marks. It's at that point that we use the robust ranges of the weighted marks against the robust averages to identify outliers. We remove those outliers and then we recalculate the robust means for each student, and that gives us the final mark. So it's a fairly involved process, and in the spreadsheet this essentially it becomes equivalent to one sheet per step. You've heard me talk enough about the theory now, so does it actually do anything? Does this process work? When we ran this last year, we took our data and agglomerated it and provided the results here. So this shows on the cohort scale the effect of applying the weightings. So this is to attempt to remove the systematic errors that we see from between easy markers to harsh markers. So for both of the events that we applied this algorithm to, so Ingenuity is the expo and the seminar presentation, remarkably, by coincidence, they both ended up at exactly 83% of the marks, ended up within plus or minus 10% of average. So roughly speaking, it means that our systematic error reweighting fixed around about 15% of potential outliers automatically. So this step is really important then. So we're certainly not catching a huge number of problems here, but if we have some people who are marking a plus 10%, some people who are marking minus 10%, we'd get a lot more outlier elimination if we didn't do this reweighting step. It also gives us a little bit of confidence. We can track these numbers and identify people who are on the lower or the higher ends of the scale, and maybe give them some coaching around, or when you come back next year, although there's no big issue because we do rescale it, it's probably worth figuring out why you're giving higher marks than your collaborator, or why you're giving lower marks. To go into the outlier detection side of things, for the Ingenuity and for the seminar process, you can see that we're dealing with about 1,000 to 1,600 marks being processed for those respectively. For the expo presentation, where we're getting larger numbers of industry coming to help assess, we've got 5 to 15 marks per project. In a lot of cases, this is really, and we see a lot of good agreement when we're getting kind of a larger number of marks per project. But we are still seeing projects where just from happenstance, random selection effects, that some projects just don't get as many marks as others. And so in these cases, it's still really important that we're using a robust approach for identifying the outliers. So for the expo event, where we have industry judges and they're not trained academics, they're not calibrated, they're not marking people every day of the week, we did see a larger number of outliers in this event. So about 5% of the marks that we looked at, so 50 out of 1,000, were rejected as being outliers. For the seminar event, which was marked only by academics, we had about 1% of the marks come through were considered as outliers there. And as we've said before, for this event, we do have a fewer number of assessors because it is marked only by academics at the moment. I mean, that might change in the future, but it's sort of a side comment in terms of the context of this presentation. I did want to mention one last thing about this process. So the challenging thing about doing marking at scale like this is that you can't exactly just take that spreadsheet and email it around to people, because it's not, you can't de-identify it in a way that it really works to provide the information to the students that they want without also sharing a whole bunch of other information that it's not appropriate that they do have. So the somewhat over-engineered step that we have at the very end of this process is that the giant spreadsheet creates the final marks for our students and for our groups. And then there's a post-processing step which at the moment is written in MATLAB, where it reads in the Excel file, trawls through all of the data that has been calculated, and then exports that data to a LaTeX file. Or I should say, rather, a very large series of LaTeX files. So we can then have a script that runs over each one of them, compiles them into an individual report for each student, and then we use the Canvas API with some code that's written in Lua at the moment, although there's arguably better Python libraries for doing this now, which individually sends off every report to every student. So I really think that this is a key part of the assessment process, because it's the best way that we can actually show the students how we're doing these calculations. It identifies where the outliers have occurred, kind of grays them out or puts a line through them or something like that, and most importantly then collates all of the little comments that the assessors have made and includes them in the document as well. So this is although there's a little bit of work in keeping this code alive and rerunning it every year and making sure that it's actually doing what it's supposed to be doing, this is quite an automated part of the process now, and it's something that I'm really pleased to be able to give back to the students, so that they actually we can close the loop in terms of why they received the marks that they did. So I feel like this presentation in my office has meandered down some rabbit holes and gone for a lot longer than when we first gave this talk. In conclusion, we have to mark honours project students a couple of times throughout the year. We've got the expo, we've got the seminar, and in both of those events we have panels or groups of academics and industry people coming in and giving marks which are not always consistent with each other. So we have developed a system which attempts to address the assessor biases, any sort of subjectivity that they might have about the subject matter or the people, and tries to eliminate the random discrepancies that you might see when you throw 100 assessors into a room of several hundred students. Importantly, the process all is efficient in the fact that it is a fairly turnkey methodology now, although it does involve many different steps with many different tools. Each one of those steps happens pretty automatically though, so there's minimal intervention in what needs to happen besides some checking along the way and eliminating a little bit of code rot from year to year. And the outcome of this process is that we have much greater transparency in our marking processes to the students, and the students receive much better feedback than they used to get. So on the whole, we have a happier coordinator because we have a system that actually works efficiently, but more importantly, we have happier students who, well, we said before, we're not trying to make them happy just because, but we are hopefully making them appreciate the processes more around the way that we go, the lengths with which we go to make sure that they're being assessed fairly and equitably. And that should make them happier. Thanks very much.